So this week we are going to cover Flask. Flask, as we get into it, we're going to start to get into these mini web frameworks, right? So the big difference in this class versus something that like computer science will do, where they'll teach you more of like PyGUI type stuff, is I get you to build these into mini web frameworks. And the reason for that is they're the most popular way of getting Python type data live. And if you want to build a really quick web application based around whatever your little project is, Flask and Jenga are the best ones to get you up and running by far. So there's Flask and there's Django, and really the difference between the two is Django is going to be like full-fledged MVC, and we'll talk about all that later on. It's like a big package, right? I mean, there's a lot it can do, but there's a lot of times that you don't need that heavy of a lift. You just want to build a simple web application real quick and easy. And that's kind of where Flask steps in. They operate and function very similar to one another. So once we learn Flask, those concepts will carry over into Django, and then Django will expand a little bit more. So this week we'll have a mini project, and I'll have that for you on, let's see, Thursday. Today, we're going to kind of do an overview of Flask, and then Flask has their own tutorials, and Django and Flask have really good tutorials. It's been a while since I've done the Flask one, but when I first learned Django, I actually just went through the documentation, read it all, not all of it, right? Read all the highlights, and then went through their tutorial, and their tutorial was awesome. That was the best way of learning how to do that project, was to go through their basic tutorial. So we're going to run through the Flask one here, and then I have a project for us that we're going to start building out on Thursday, and then you guys will have your own projects that will kind of extend off of that. All right, so Flask itself, there's a link out here. I put these out here on Blackboard. You should have the link to the documentation. You'll have a link directly to the tutorial, and then you'll have the Jenga templates here. So the idea is to be able to create a small but complete application in form of a web application. And we're going to go through the overall view of that. Flask itself depends on the Jenga template engine, as well as the Wsgi Toolkit. So Jenga templates is basically a template style that you can use where you can create HTML files like your web pages, and you can do Python directly inside the HTML file. So when you start building out tables, or you want to start building out data, pulling it out of Python dictionary, for example, you can shove that into a Jenga template, which is an HTML document, and you can do little bits of Python directly in the template. It's really slick and allows you to build things very, very quickly. This Wsgi toolkit is what the web framework is. So by default, we're going to, and we'll cover a little bit of that later down the road. When you put these into production, you can have things like a, what is that? Nginx. You can do a Nginx web server in front, and then you can run this WYSIWYG server back behind it. So we'll go through that. Or Wsgi, sorry. All right, so user guide. It's going to roll us through how to get things installed and get everything set up. We'll do this for the tutorial. There's a couple different dependencies in here, so it's going to talk about that Wsgi for Flask. You have the Jenga templating system. You have markup safe that comes with the Jenga side of things. This is how we can make sure that it escapes untrusted input into the rendering templates. This is going to prevent things such as SQL injection attacks or other attacks inside of our code. We definitely want to do this. Otherwise, the cybersecurity guys on my side of the house will be able to come and break our web applications and steal data right away, right? That's what we train to do over there, mostly with SQL injection, and mostly because they were old PHP websites and web servers that did not have any kind of escaping of user input, and therefore you can just directly crack into different people's websites. So this is what prevents us from allowing that to happen, even with our simple web applications. It's dangerous. We'll actually do the signing of the data to ensure the integrity, and creates a session Flask cookie, and we'll deal a little bit more with that. Click itself is the framework for writing command line applications, and in this case, we're not too worried about that form of it. Blinkers used for signals, and that is just a way for us to build web applications that if we get signal for something, we can change the website, or we can change the code that's on the HTML, etc. And we'll leave the rest of these out for now. Okay, So setting up a virtual environment, you could do this as you follow through here, and then you can just pip install Flask. In our case, we're going to go ahead and fire up our PyCharm. License expired, huh? Okay. It's not what I wanted to see. Aha. I need to go grab my new license key. All right. Stand by. I'll tell you what, I'll just do it on the outside one for now. No, I have it. It just, I had to wait for it to expire before I could renew it. All right. So if we go to File, New Project, over here on the left, you'll see Jenga and you'll see Flask. We're going to just start with the Flask setting. If we go in there, go ahead and give your name here, and we're just going to call it Flask Tut for now, or tutorial. If we go down here to more settings, you'll see options for the templating language. And in this case, Flask uses Jenga 2, and that we're going to put these inside the templates folder. So we'll go ahead and just hit create, say this window. And that will go ahead and set up our virtual environment. And while that's running, again, you can do the same thing. You just create a virtual environment at the command line if you want to do it that way, and you can pip install Flask, and it'll install all the dependencies. If you do it through PyCharm, that's essentially what it's doing. It's right now installing Flask, installing all the dependencies. For example, if we come down here and look at our terminal, and we do a pip freeze, we can see all the packages that we just talked about are now installed in this virtual environment. So things like Jenga, markup safe, the Wsgi package, it's dangerous, etc. All of that should be up and running for us. Now, at its most basic level, this is what you're going to see here. So you have from Flask, import Flask, and then you're going to have app equals Flask underscore name underscore. This is just going to set up our app name as we're going to run it. In this case, we have a decorator. So anytime you see this @ symbol, that's typically a decorator. And in this case, we're defining a route. And if the decorator route, notice that we're at a slash. So this would be like if I go to google.com / right? I'm at the home page. So this is basically defining the home page of our web application. And in that case, we're going to have our function here called hello world, just hello underscore world, real simple return hello world inside of there. And then in the if underscore name equals main, go ahead and run this application. This means that if I run this Python file by itself to go ahead and start this application, notice how it calls back to the app run, and it will go ahead and execute this code. If we look up here at the top, we have a couple different folders. We have a templates folder, which is currently empty. This is where we would put our HTML code. And up here at the top, we also have static. This would be things where we could stick our JavaScript or our CSS code if we want to style things. That kind of stuff is what we'd run up in static. All right. If we just run this right up at the top, you'll see over here on the left, when you run a Flask environment, you're going to see that we're set up to run this in the command line. And once it's up and running, it is a development server. You don't want to use it in production. Otherwise, you need to use a production-based WYSIWYG. For what we're doing in this class, you guys don't have to do that. However, for our final project, if those want to set it up on a production server, in other words, if you want LaurieFrazier.com to be your project, then I can walk you through the steps of getting a domain name and how you would publish this out there. If you guys remember in your GitHub toolkit that you've got free credits for things like DigitalOcean and a couple other ones out there. I use DigitalOcean for these and Jenga because it's really fast and easy to use, especially because it's kind of built into PyCharm. You can do it. And then I've got some other deployment environments where I use like Caprover and some other ones. I'll explain those when we get a little bit further in, if you guys are wanting to put your stuff into production. For now, when you guys are just coding, doing all that, you're going to use the local development server. And it will tell you what your URL is. So by default right now, it runs on port 5000. So if I click on this link here, and I'll see a website pop up, and on port 5000, we get our hello world that we had inside of our code, right? And that's just this return hello world. So right now it's super basic. It's not doing anything fancy. It's just a hello world application. Anybody have any questions on the back end of Flask thus far? We obviously haven't covered too much. So the key parts to know on this is we'll set up our app routes, and we'll kind of do this when we go through the tutorial. But what really matters is when you run this, it's going to be running on port 5000. It's the big kicker. The default port for the development server is running on 5000. All right. So now that we got everything up and running on the installation part, we'll have a quick start, and you can set up this minimal application as you can see here. Notice by default, we just sent hello world. We could send it in a paragraph format here. Notice how we're just returning HTML code, right? So at first we import the Flask side of things. We use the route decorator, this here, to tell us what the URL is when we trigger that function. So an example of that would be, is say I copy this exact same code, right? And down here, I put /admin, and then we change this text to say, you are on the administrator page. And then if I just rerun this application, sorry, I called it hello world. Okay, go out here, we can see our website. I still get hello world. If I go to /admin, you'll see that I get to the administrator page. So you can see how basic and simple and fast you can get websites up and running on that side of things. Okay. Please don't open Internet Explorer. I did not mean to click on that. No. 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 We don't talk about IE. It doesn't exist. Yes. What's that? You know, unfortunately, a lot of people use it because it was the only thing. Yeah, it's the only thing to download Google. Yeah. I was alive in a time where it was not even installed in the operating system, and then they forced it in the operating system, and you immediately downloaded Netscape Navigator, which I know none of you have any clue what that is. But that, okay, thank you. That doesn't make me feel too old. That was the go-to before Google existed, kind of thing. Actually, it was Internet Explorer, Netscape Navigator, and then after Netscape Navigator was Firefox, really. And then from there, it was Google once Google came out. And now Google's on it. And it's so much better than IE. Now, I'm a toss-up between what I'm doing at times between Mozilla Firefox and Chrome and back and forth. And it doesn't matter. And then, of course, there's the offshoots of all the Chrome, right? You got all the like 10 different ones out there, Opera and a bunch of other ones that are just offshoots. Anyway, we're gonna nice try. All right. So by default, everything's going to be set up in HTML when we set it up here, and we talked about this part. So when we're running this server, when we actually hit run up here, what we're really doing, if we go to the command line, is we're essentially running this command here, where it's Python -m Flask, right? And in our case, we're not running Flask. Our file is called app.py. And if we run that, oops, sorry. Then we have to tell it exactly what we're going to do. And M is just going to bring up this command line or the options that you can run through here. So when you look at this, you can see .m Flask, and then you pass it what file and all that stuff you want to run. So in this case, we would do something like this. And you can see this hello, that's the name of our app. Remember, that was our Flask name that we set here. Hello, and run. Not hello. No, what am I typing wrong? Am I typing? No. Okay, my bad. That makes sense. App equals app. There we go. And so that's what you're getting that to pull up there. And then if I go up, you know, the website's up and running. So you can run this on a command line. You can do whatever you want. That's your one-liner though, if you want to run it on your own. Otherwise, when we're inside PyCharm, you can just use the play up here and it does the same thing. Another thing you can do is if you come up here to edit this configuration and you run here, you can tell it if you want to run any additional parameters inside there. If you want to turn on debug, which you guys may want to in the beginning, you come in and check that box and it will go ahead and add the debug flag when you're running that through. You can also tell it what Python interpreter you want. Now it's running 3.9 because I'm not inside my virtual environment, but that's fine. And you can add those source code to those different routes. So this is kind of handy if you guys want to set up your own one to run through there. So if I run this now, you'll see the debug mode is on. And what's nice about that is you'll see this debugger pin. And when we get into debugging here a little bit later, if I refresh this, you can see I pulled here. I can go to the admin. I get the admin page. But down here at the bottom, you can actively see people accessing the web server, right? So you can see that I pulled this page. I got a 200, that I pulled this page, and I was able to get a 200 status code as well. Okay. Yeah.
So if you were to create branches and then you ran it, will bring up all of the pages. So instead of having it be like the hello world admin on the same text file, if you were to make it a branch and then press run, would it?
Yeah, if you split those off to a different file. Yes. Yep. And actually, you know, right now we're putting this all in one main Python file. You would eventually break that out, then you can import those over. You can also create like a routes file and it would have all these different ones in there too. That's really where Jenga comes into play. It's got a whole URL system and everything else. Yep. Nope. Like for now, this is kind of what we're looking at just to get everybody up and running. Yes. So right now we're just returning code that's getting dumped into HTML. You can actually build an HTML template and then you tell it to send all these variables to the template. And you just use, you know, like an F string in Python, where you're just putting the curly braces and what you want in that spot. And then the code goes on. You know what I mean? So like if we're here in the code, we'll get to this here in a little bit, but say I have a variable called name. Welcome to whatever, you know, I mean, I have my text and then I do another curly brace and this is my age. And then I have a bunch of other text. We format that with our F strings currently. So like if I do something like print that F string that, right? Something like this. That's what we've been doing in the past. The HTML code works very similar, meaning that what you put in the curly braces, when I pass variables into that template, it auto injects that stuff in. So you build this template HTML file, and then we pass all these variables into it. It'll automatically populate and fill it on the fly. So you can be very, very quick and fill that out. So regardless of like different pages, if I template my page right, I only have to write 1 or 2 HTML files, but I can spit a whole bunch of data out on that. It just generates new templates every time. So the debug stuff that we were talking about, if you have a break in your code, it will actually spit that out on the screen so that we can see that. If we don't have debug on, you won't actually be able to determine really what's diving deep in there. So like here, you don't want to leave debug on permanently, right? And it's protected by a pin. And that's so that when you're actually running the page, you have to put in that pin and then you can get a bunch of debug log information out of there. Let's see, HTML escaping. When we're returning HTML, so like, for example, here's that F string I'm talking about. You could say hello and then escape name, and we could put whatever we want inside that name. You'll have to send that up. You can use a script for JavaScript if you want to set up alerts, just like you would in JavaScript and all the other rules. We talked about routing. So at the most basic, we have routes like this. We have route hello, and we showed how to use that route decorator in order to get you to the URL that you want to do. And you can attach multiple rules to each thing as it goes down there. Here's the mark safe and escape. This allows you to escape those variables. So if there is potentially, you get an input from somebody, right? But their input isn't their name. They actually dump in a bunch of HTML code inside that name URL field. This will escape that code so that it doesn't run on the server side. And that's how you can run protection on side of that. That's what markup safe is meant to do. And that's why you have escape here. So for example, here, if we have a username page that shows up, right, and show their username profile, that we actually escape that username, because if their username was a string of HTML code, that would cause an issue on your web server, and you could actually break into the web server at that point, or extract information out of some database inside the web server. So very good to use that escape decorator when you want to pull information back out of there. All right. Just like we do in regular Python, you can convert things to strings, integers, floats, and you can set up paths as well as a UUID string coming in there as well. Okay. Let's see. Yes. So, for the URL side of things, when we're routing things, notice how I have /about is pulling up an about page. On this one has projects with the / at the end. If you access a URL without the / at the end, it's going to send you the URL with all the trailing slashes inside of it. So it's going to throw that on the end of it. If you want a specific page, you can do this side of it, right? So if I do a /, it's going to send me to the folder, and it will pull up the default index file or whatever's in that particular folder. If it doesn't have it, it'll produce a 404, and we'll figure that out real quick here as we start building stuff out. Let's see. This is going to take you through all the different pieces. So we'll just talk about these different pieces and then get into the tutorial, because it's really the tutorials where the easiest way to learn how this stuff works. So to build a URL for a function, you can use this URL for. What that's going to do is, say we want to have a page where we have /user, and then the username is actually the URL link as this goes across, right? For example, they use 2.2x and they inject some other stuff inside this link so they get to the right page. We can use this app.test for conquests. We can do a URL for index, login, and then next equals / so that the next time they go to login, it sends them to the index page. And then we can set up a profile with user John Doe, and that will create URLs that look like this when we actually get published out. All right. HTTP methods, you guys should know this from basic web design and such like that. So in Flask, you can use a request, and this is how we can get information from people from the methods of get and post. So if I'm going to submit a bunch of data, I am doing a what? Post, right? And so I have them fill out usually things like a form, HTML form, and that form gets combined and then sent back to me. And what this little code here will do is send them to the login page, right? If they're not doing a post, in other words, they're not submitting, then we simply go ahead and call this show login form. If they get back to this page because they hit submit and we're sending them back to the page, that becomes a post, and then we're going to do something with that login that they did. So this is a simple if else. If it's the first time it shows, it's going to run this code. If it's when they're actually posting data, it'll end up running this code here. All right. So then you would have these two functions down here, which is like login.get. That's going to show the login form. And then you can also separate this out for the post side of things, and you can do that here. Now notice this is one way of doing it. You can also break those out into two different views, so it's easier to keep track of, in which case this one is the .get and this one is the .post. So this is a much better way of doing it as a whole if you're going to have a whole lot more code on each one of those. If it's just a real simple page, then you can get away with this method here. Anybody got any questions or about that? Specifically, as we get deep into this, and it's probably something most of you have never seen, don't be afraid to ask questions. If I'm going too fast, again, going through the tutorial, this makes a whole lot more sense through here. All right, we talked about the static folder because we're building dynamic web applications, meaning that we're pulling in data and it's going to display it based on what we're doing. That's usually where your CSS and your JavaScript files are coming from. You can use this in here in order to generate the static files. Use a special static tag as this here, and then you can set up the file name. And then what this will allow us to do is generate that inside of our template so that we can pull that out. Now, when we build basic applications, and I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself, but most of you guys should know a little bit of CSS and a little bit of HTML at this point, right? You guys all did INF601 at some point. You can go ahead and write your own CSS and that kind of code, but I encourage you to use some kind of boilerplate because it makes things easy. And in real life, this is what we all do, right? So there's things out there like Bootstrap, and I'll talk a little bit about that if you guys haven't used it before. There's Bootstrap that allows you to get a bunch of the nice GUI things that you would expect off a website, right? Does anybody not know what Bootstrap is? Bootstrap? Okay. I was gonna say. I'm gonna have to resend you to 250. So anyway, Bootstrap's a great one. There's several out there that are like Bootstrap, the boiler templates. This one is probably the one that I am most familiar with. I've grown up with a couple different ones out there, and now there's a bunch of different ones out there. So use whatever you want. All right. Talking about generating HTML from within Python is not that great, right? Because we have to do a bunch of HTML coding. We have to send this stuff up and do that. No, we're going to use templates. So to render a template, we use render template method. And then all you have to do is provide the name of the template you want. So if we go back and look at these pages here, right? Let's copy this into our code for now. We'll kind of overwrite what we had done so far. Oops, too much. All right. And of course, Python or PyCharm is going to get complacent, or it's going to complain if we put some of these lines together like this, but that's okay. All right. So what this is going to do is when we run hello and we get some kind of name out of here, it's going to render this template, right? That is coming from hello.html. And then that means we need to create an HTML template over here inside of our files. So if you look over here, we got our application.py. And then in the templates folder, we'd have a hello.html. The other way you can run this is that you have your application as a whole. You have an init.py, and this is going to allow you to create your own module in there that loads that folder up as a package inside your program, in which case the templates are nested inside of there. All right. This is probably the first one that we're going to use and really care about, is just have our simple application.py, whatever we call it. And then we have our templates folder in the hello on this side. So we can use it as a module this way, as opposed to a package, but you can do it either way. All right. So if we build up an HTML document here, and it's going to be extremely basic. So if we right click on templates, go to new and just say HTML file, we can call this hello, enter. You'll see this hello.txt. Now, this setup is meant for a standard HTML document, right? It's got the header, or it's got the HTML language, it's got a head, it's got a body, and that's really all we need in that side, right? When we do a Jenga template, I'm sorry, you're going to have something like this: doc type HTML, which you can see is still in here. We have the title from the main system. And then if we passed in a name, it says hello, whatever name passed in. Notice this is in a header format. Otherwise, in this case, an else, we have just straight hello world. Then we have to put this into if in order to end this statement. So this is really where we could do Python within a Jenga template. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut this part out. When you do Python code inside of it, you use a curly brace and a percentage sign. Then you can go ahead and run HTML code or Python code exactly as you would predict it would. Okay. In which case it'll pull back this H1. Otherwise, it's going to send this here. So we're going to go ahead and save this. We'll go back to our static page here. Whoops, back to our application. There we go. And on this name part, we just have the word name. And we're going to go ahead and stop. Run this app. Pull up the page, and you'll notice that we get a page not found, right? And the reason we're getting a page not found is notice how there is no simple home screen anymore, right? We have to go to the hello app, and then we would get the name on the backside. So we need to go /hello, and we get hello world back. And the reason we're getting hello world back is because we're not actually passing the name into here. This name is, there's nothing, right? Hello name equals none. However, if I set this name to say Jason, and then come through here, hit save. Now, if I save this, it's automatically going to restart. It detects a change inside of our code. It'll automatically restart the web server. So anytime we make a change in here, Flask is going to determine that there was a change and restart it. That means I don't have to hit stop, restart, and do all the other garbage. So I come in here, I refresh the page. Notice how now it's hello Jason. So if I pass something to this function, in this case a name, it will display it. If it doesn't, then it just goes ahead and ignores it and goes down to the next code. Now, obviously, I can pass this in on any other page. So I can get their user profile information, store it, and then I can build our profile page where it just dumps the data into that page. Anybody have any questions on that part? All right. So inside the template, you can set up things like and have access to the config, the request, your session cookie, G-objects, as well as that URL for and get flash messages. The templates, you can also use inheritance. So say at the top of every single page, I want my, like a menu bar, right? And it's at the top of every single page. Well, then I just build an HTML template that has that menu bar in it. And then inside my other form, I can say, what do you want to call it? You can basically import that file in and it will always shove that up at the top. That way I don't have to go to every single page and modify every single menu bar. I just build the menu bar once and inherit it from everything else below it. Makes it much, much easier to pull that in there. And then you can use this markup class here in order to isolate things that come inside there. All right. Let's see, request is going to allow us to do things like the method post that we talked about. And so you can use Flask import request and go on through. I'm not going to go through each one of these. I want you guys to actually start building a web application. So let's do, I think we've covered at least the stuff to get us started there. Okay. So the idea is that we're going to create a basic blog application. This is pretty common. You'll do a similar thing over in Jenga next week. And this blog application is called Flasker. And you want users to be able to register, log in, create posts, edit posts, and delete their own posts. Right? Real simple web application. You'll be able to package that up and install that application on any computer once we get done. So it's going to look something like this, where you have all the posts, they can create a new one, they can edit their old ones, delete it, and have a login, log out type function. All right. We've designed this, they set this up in order for us to use a little bit of extension libraries, and another project will go further out. So Flask is really flexible. You can set it up to have these general HTML templates and move it all the way through. All right. So let's get started here. In this project, we're going to create our, try to do this in a side-by-side, but that's going to be hard on the screen. Give it a shot. Okay. And this is going to be really hard with that guy. So let's move him up there. All right. So what we want to do inside my little Flask tut here, or you can create it something else inside of there. We are going to create a new directory and call it flask-tutorial. There we go. And we want this hello.py inside of there. So we're going to go in here, new Python file. We're going to call it hello. Inside there, we paste in this code. Again, this is really the basic stuff. We're just having our application name here, setting up a hello world. All right. Now, inside this overall project directory, you're going to have a couple, I'll tell you what, we're going to clean this up a little bit here so that we can follow along here and not worry about file names and whatnot. So we're just going to do a whole new project of Flask, and we're going to call it specifically the Flask tutorial here. Flask tug would have worked, but in order to make sure everything matches up with what you guys see over here, I want to do the same. Okay, so we've got this app name here that returns this same thing. However, we need to change this to hello in order to match up with the tutorial that we're doing. So if we right click on this, you'll go down to refactor, and then under refactor, you can go to rename. We'll call that hello. So again, you right click on this, go to refactor and rename. The reason that we refactor, if you guys aren't familiar with that term inside of PyCharm, is if we change this file name, it's going to scan through the entire application and make sure that you changing that file name doesn't break your code. So it's going to go through and double check, and then it will tell you, hey, You called it hello world. It's being referenced by 4 other files. Are you sure you want to change that name? And then you'd have to go and fix that in your other files. Okay. So in this directory, we see our Flasker, which is going to be a Python package that has our application code. We have a test directory, which is going to be containing our test modules. And we have our virtual VNV environment, which is where this is going through. So remember, I told you in the beginning, you can do this as either a Python package or you could do it as a module. In this case, we're going to set it up as a package. So we're going to look at all these different files, and this is what our end project will look like going through here. Okay. And that's pretty much what we see out here. Only your static files and your templates are actually going to be inside the Flask-R package. Like it's mentioned here, when you're using version control, which is what we're using with Git, you would want to add this information to your Git Ignore. This will make sure that you're not setting up your tests and all your other stuff going through there isn't getting sent up to Git. You don't want that kind of stuff set up. So for example, we are going to use our Git package here later on. So let's go ahead and create a new file, and we're going to do a .git ignore. And inside this Git Ignore, we're just going to copy and paste this code up here. We can save that for now. Now, obviously, we don't have this set up and hooked up to our GitHub yet. If you guys want to do that, you can simply take this and we will share project on GitHub. We call it this. Go ahead and set it to your private one, and then you go ahead and share. Because your GitHub information is already set up in PyCharm, it'll send it out. If we look here, you'll notice a bunch of this comes up. Do we want to submit this? We do not want the .idea. We actually need to add that to our Git Ignore later. That .idea folder is all of your stuff for PyCharm, right? So we don't ever want to include the .idea stuff. But we do want to include these 2 files, Git Ignore and hello.py. And this will be our initial commit. We'll hit add. And then if we come out here on this link, we'll see on GitHub. Obviously, it's not going to be posted to the right link because I'm not logged in there, but it would show up. I lost my page. There we are. Okay. All right, we got this set up. So now we're going to set up the concept of applications inside of our overall project, right? Our overall project is called Flask Tutorial. We want a simple application in there called Flasker, right? So we're going to come up here to Flask Tutorial, and we're going to create a new folder. Now, again, here it's going to have you do MK, Flask-R, and stuff like that. That works great if you're in Linux or doing that kind of stuff. In Windows, you would have to use the Windows equivalent. Because we're using PyCharm, we can just create a new folder. It does the exact same concept. So we're going to use Flasker, right? And inside there, we need to create this simple init.py file, right? So we're going to go to here. We're going to right-click new file, and we're going to call it _init _.py. And we're going to add that to our Git page. And then we're going to copy this code in. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And for those of you guys online, are you guys able to keep up with me? Or are you guys just planning on watching the video?
We're keeping up.
Okay. Okay. All right. So this create app is an application factory function, and you're going to learn more or add to it as we go down here, but there's a lot that it's setting up. This is basically your configuration file, right? So when we come in here, notice that test config is currently set to none, so we're not sending any information into it. And inside there, we have the Flask name is an instance relative config. That's true. We'll talk more about that. That basically tells the app that configuration files are relative to the instance folder, meaning they're inside of it, right? So the instance folder is located outside Flask-R package, and it can hold local data that shouldn't be committed out to version control because we ignored it, right? That could be things like our configuration secrets, passwords, things that we wouldn't want to submit up to GitHub. right? Security tokens, things like that. If we were using an API, remember last week when we were using like Rapid API, instead of me putting the key directly in my code, I would put that in a configuration file that's not submitted up to GitHub. I wouldn't want to put my Rapid API key in the code that I submit to GitHub. So, okay. Let's look. This next part here, app.config.from mapping. This is going to set up some different codes. So secret key is used by Flask and the extensions in order to keep data safe. If it's set to dev, it provides a convenient value during development, but it should be overridden with some random value when we actually deploy. This would be something where we would create like a UUID and we could use that, or we could have a randomly generated character 12, random generate 12 characters if we want. Whatever that secret key is, we just need to set it ourselves. In production and things like that, you would have this as a variable set to the outside. So again, nobody can ever find it on the system. It should not be in your code. All right. Database, in this case, this is going to be where we set up a SQLite database. So Flask-R, we don't have to use a database. It's much better if you use a database when you're building web applications, right? But we don't need to have a full-blown, Postgres server, SQL server, nodes. There's tons of different database servers out there. We don't need a full-blown one. We're just going to use a flat file, and that's what SQLite is. So SQLite is just going to create a .db file inside your folder. Everything's ran off that. Now, would you use that in production? Probably not. If you're going to have thousands and thousands of users hitting your web application, you're going to need a much more robust database server. If you guys are just building these simple applications or a simple web server, use SQLite. It runs great. When you start running into issues, reformat that data and ship it off to like a main Postgres server or something like that. All right. So what this is going to do is use the OS path join. If you guys remember this from our 360 class, that is going to create the file structure, the path, in order to point to this flaskr.sql file. Okay. Let's see. By using OS path join here, OS make ders is going to make sure that file exists. If it doesn't, Flask does not automatically create that. But it needs to be created in order for that SQL database file to exist. Okay. Let's see, test config here, mapping. That's what this is trying to do. So it's trying to make sure that the instance folder exists, OS make ders. If not, we get a pass on this side creating that folder. All right. Then we create our simple hello page and it says hello world. By default, because it's going to load this create app, we're just going to return this whole application back over to our main thing. So to run this, and we want to have our debug turned on, so we can either run it from the command line. Whoop, got a chat here. Okay, keeping up, good. We will want to edit our Flask tutorial, and we will want to turn on debug here and apply that. Okay. Now, again, you can run this from the command line. It would look something like Flask --app Flasker --debug, and then we would have run there, right? And we should get our application to pop up, and we can see that this page loads up here, right? And we're going to get an error here, right? Because we're not going to the /hello, right? We just loaded the basic page. Get rid of these extra ones here. Okay. You have to go to this /hello in order for it to actually pop up, in which case we get our hello world to come back. So this is very similar to that original one that we set up. The only difference is now we're actually loading this internal application folder here. All right. Let's get back to the main page here. Go back. There we go. If you end up seeing an error down here, which you might, it'll be this error number 98 or a Windows Win error or something like that. That just means that you have another Flask project running somewhere in the background, right? Or something else is tying up port 5000. Were you guys online able to get this little hello world part to run?
The first test app, but I haven't I haven't tried this one yet. I'm just focusing on the tutorial.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, so now that we got our little application up and running, we need to kind of set up that database so we can start storing data in it. So again, this one's going to use SQLite. It's a very simple database that allows us to store our users and our posts. Python is going to come in with built-in support for SQLite based on the SQLite 3 module. Okay. It's very convenient because you don't have to set up an entire separate database server. It's all built into Python. However, again, as I mentioned before, it works great for small applications. Don't try to use this with 1,000 users, even over 100 users. If they're really hitting the system, that's going to flatline a SQLite database, right? But it's very simple to work with. A lot of students that will do projects like for this class and even their final project, SQLite will work just fine. Right? If you guys are wanting to put your project into production, then I would show you how to use something other than SQLite. We would probably use something like Postgre. It's probably the most common one that I use. I try not to use MySQL or those because they're owned by Oracle. And once you wrap yourself around MySQL stuff and Oracle comes in and then smacks you with a giant license kind of thing. They say it's open source. It's not open source. I'm here to tell you it's not open source. If you were to actually go commercial in production with MySQL, you actually have to pay a ridiculous license on that. The company that I worked with before I started coming back to teach full time, we built an entire product based on MySQL 3 back in the day. That was before Oracle even owned it. It was free. It was open source. It was the most common database everybody used. When Oracle purchased MySQL, they actually bought it as an open source thing and then made it kind of closed source. They forced everybody to go to MySQL 5. They were not going to allow you to stay on a 3x license. We couldn't do that because the entire application was written on a 32-bit platform. So we could not convert that product over to a 64-bit platform. It just would not work the way we designed it. Again, this is circa 1999 when we built it. So what they ended up doing was charging us per license for every device we had in the field. Well, what we did is we had little one-use servers that were out at close to 200 to 300 community colleges, high schools, and universities across the US. So for every single one of those, we had to end up paying for a license. You can imagine I think it was like $1,000, $1,500 a pop for everybody that we did. So it was $250,000 that we had to write a check for on licensing. And then we no longer got that moved over because we didn't have a choice. We then rewrote the entire application to use something different. But in the meantime, as long as that ran, we had to pay that license. And it was almost $250,000 a year for us to run that. Something that we usually didn't have to budget for. It was a free open source thing. Next thing we know, we got smacked with a license lawsuit. So be careful when you build your applications and such. Just because it says it's free and open source doesn't necessarily mean it's free and open source. Right? Side tangent, but trust me, you want to try to think about that stuff ahead of time. Postgre is a really good one right now. That's one of the most ones that I see used. There may be reasons to use things like NoSQL. Sam, is there any other ones that you particularly use?
Actually, you can use SQL Express. So SQL Express is free. It just lacks the interface. So if you can code all the fancy features which are codable via SQL, then you can get all the benefits of like SQL Enterprise at the cost of zero SQL Express.
Gotcha. And I won't go too deep into the database classes. If you guys need to go deeper in that, I encourage you to go take the database class that we have here on campus. It's really good. It teaches you the Oracle side of things because it's an Oracle Academy. But as long as you understand how to write SQL-based statements, you can pretty much fluctuate in all of these, right? You just need to know SQL syntax. Okay. So what we're going to do is we need to create a db.py, and this is going to set up all of our database information. So underneath here, we're going to go to new and file. We're going to type in db, and that will get us our db file. We'll go ahead and add this to our repository. And we're going to copy this code in, talk a little bit more about it here. All right. So we're going to import SQLite 3. Remember that we don't have to install this package. It's actually built into Python. The G that you see here that we're importing from Flask is just a special object that's unique for each request. It'll store user data, have multiple functions during the GET request. It's used to create new connections to the database. Okay. Current app is another special object, and we can see we're importing that here. This is going to point to the Flask application that handles the request. Since we use the application factory, aka we put everything under Flask R here, there's no application object when writing the rest of your code. And therefore, when we call this application of getDB, it's going to be created right off the bat. And so current app can be used inside of there. Okay. When we want to connect to the database, we set up this function here called getDB. If DB is not in G, meaning that we haven't imported it in there yet, then g.db is going to use SQLite3.connect, and this is just connecting to our local file. We're telling it that we're going to use the configuration of database, and it's going to detect the type as SQLite3. Right? If it already found DB, then it's going to allow us to use the row factory inside of here. This is how we create rows inside of our database. Then it comes back. On the close DB, this allows us to close that file when our application closes out. So when we send a request, we pull the information, we get it back. When it's done, we close the connection out. We don't want to leave that connection open. Anybody have any questions there? Okay. We're going to create another file under Flask R here. This one is going to be our Sql Syntax File. This usually is what we're used to create the empty tables and basically set up our SQL file. There's a couple different things you can do here. If you go to DB Navigator, we can set up a connection and do all that. We're not going to do that for this simple project. I'll probably show you that Thursday. So for now, what we're going to do is just create a, just click on File up here at the top. We're going to call it schema.sql. And we'll go ahead and add that file. Now you'll notice up here at the top, it says no data sources are configured to run SQL and provide code assistance. We can configure that and it will tell us exactly how to set all that up. Same way here on SQL dialect is not configured. You can change the dialect to whatever you want. We're just going to use this the schema that pulls in here. So ignore those error messages for now because we're not going to set up this data source just yet. We'll go ahead and copy this stuff in. And then we're going to take a look at this code. What this is going to do is going to drop our tables when we first set up our scheme. We have a way of telling it to create all new information. If those tables exist, drop them. And so we'll worry about that. Otherwise, we're going to create our table called user. We're going to have an ID, which is our primary key inside this particular table, which will auto increment. We have a username and we have a password. Right now, we're just storing these as text. Okay. On this username, it needs to be unique, which means it cannot match any other username in the database and it cannot be null. On the password, we just check that it's not null, right? If we set this to unique, what would happen? You got it, right? So if we set unique here, then what would happen is that you can't have the same password for multiple users. It would all have to be unique passwords too, which is what? Can you think of a reason why you'd want to do that? You got it. So for those of you guys online didn't hear that, the reason that you wouldn't want to set that field is if you set up a password and it says can't do it because that password already exists. Now all of a sudden you know somebody's password, right? And then we could just do a chunk through to find out if usernames are showing up. And then you can start trying to create a bunch of unique usernames. And if you find one that says, oh, that's not unique, you can start plugging and playing passwordless. So as a cybersecurity person, this is why we wouldn't want to do those kind of things. It would allow us to, I wouldn't call it SQL injection. I would just call it basically brute forcing the website at that point. Okay. We're going to create a second table here called post. Again, we're going to set up an ID as a primary key. Hopefully you guys have had a little bit of database and you guys understand. Does anybody not know what primary key is in a database? It's okay if you don't. I just, not knowing anybody inside there that doesn't know that. Okay. We'll auto increment that. We're going to set up an author ID, which is an integer, right? That's going to eventually tie back when we go through there. We have a created, which is creating a timestamp, and that's going to use the current timestamp as to when that post was created. We have a title, which is going to be text, it cannot be null. We have a body, which is text and cannot be null. And we're going to use a foreign key of our author ID as we set up here, right? That's going to tie back to our user ID that was set up here. And so if you guys know anything about databases, that ties this table back to this user table. Okay. All right. We need to set up in our db.py. We'll go back to that file. We need to add some additional codes that will set up that SQL database if it doesn't exist, right? So we're going to come down here, and at the bottom, we set up init. Notice in PyCharm, it wants you to have 2 empty lines between each function. So if you're seeing a bunch of squiggly lines like this underneath your init DB, it's saying that you're not following PEP 8 compliance. Does it hurt anything? Absolutely not. But in order to keep code compliant, you just hit enter once and you get 2 lines between it. All right, init DB is going to run down here. It says run the git DB command, which is going to try to run this over here, right? Once we have an open connection, it says with that current connection already open and using the schema.sql file as F as a file, we're going to execute each line of those commands. So you'll notice if you set up your own SQL database and you go into SQL, right? These are actually SQL statements that we're typing out here. We would type create table user, then we'd set up our ID, our username, our password. This is going to take each line and run that code against our database file, right? It's going to decode it as a UTF-8 file. That's all that stuff means. All right, this init DB command down here at the bottom, this is going to be when it first comes up. It will clear all the existing data and call the new tables. So it's going to come and reference back to this one, which then references back to getting the DB. Once it's all done, we set up this click.echo that we initialize the database. Right? This is when we are running command line codes. We can pass information back to the main system, and that is what this is saying, initialize the database. And we'll talk about that when we first set up our application. Any other questions so far? What time is this class end? 10:15? All right, so we got about 15 minutes to get through this part. All right, let's see. We need to have our close DB and the init DB functions need to be registered within the application instance. Otherwise, they won't be used. So we need to make sure that we init our app inside of our DB. So we're going to copy this over to our DB at the bottom. Right, we got our database set up. We need to set up our application. So we have our init app. Now, what that means is when at the command line, if we type blah, blah, blah init application, that's when it's going to call back this init our DB, set up our database, then set up our application to do all that kind of stuff. Right. We'll show about this here in a little bit. This app context is what Flask is used to call the connection to clean it up after we return the response. And this add command is going to set up our command line so that we can tell it that this command is available to the user. And we'll kind of explain that once it gets going through here. All right. Back in our init file, we're going to hit enter down here, and we're going to create our app. We'll see that at. And notice how down here this crashed because we have this running and it's saying there is no create app, right? So we need to set that up in here. Oh, that was our original create app. Sorry, I set this up wrong. Mess this up. Give me a second here. All right. What this is saying is once we get through this app code from here down, right? It's saying that we need to add from DB import DB and set up this application. So what we want to do is set this up right before we return the app right down here and paste this in. Okay. All right. So now, once we have this set up, if we go ahead and stop our program running here. And at this terminal line, if we type in Flask --app, we are working with our Flasker app. And we have a command now called initdb. And that is that application that we built up here, right? This initdb app, and it's going to set it up. When we hit enter, you'll see that we initialize the database. And over here on the left, we should have under instance, you're going to have this Flask-R SQLite file that's generated and created for us. Okay. Notice how instance is grayed out. That means that it's not going to get submitted up. And if we double click this Flask-R here, we can see this is our data source that we were talking about. Looks like we need to update a driver here. Give me just a second. There we go. We can apply. And this will allow us to have a connection out to our SQLite database here. We can hit OK. And if we click OK, we can look at our Flask-R up here at the top. Let me blow this up here so you can see. What this allows us to do is look at our database without having to go into the database and show the tables and do all that. We can see it directly inside of our PyCharm interface. So if we click under main, you'll see that we have tables set up. We have our post table with 5 columns. Those are all the column names that we set up earlier on. This is all being generated by this schema file that we created. So we can see inside of here that this information allowed us to build out this SQL database. Then we have one foreign key that's tying back those 2 tables off of post. If we go look at our user, you can see that we have an ID, usernames. Again, we have keys going back to the other side. And we can see our primary key is set to the ID. This little key right here is showing our primary key going back. Yeah. No, not yet. So right now, when we call this from the command line, this initdb command is coming what's available from this init here. So when we load this Flask-R app, this init pi here automatically gets called. So when you're running this application by default, it immediately calls this file. When we call Flask-R here, it's going to run this file. And then we created a command that allowed us to run initdb. And when we come in here, you'll see that we imported .import db, which is our db file. So that's automatically going to get imported. We go back over to here. And then from there, we're calling this init app. And if you notice at the init app, we're setting up things like, using all these other functions to create the database out. So the first thing when we run this at the terminal is going to run Flask-R, which is running init. We set this up. If we set up the initdb, it's going to automatically call the db command and then set up the init app and do that from there. And this is the decorator that says, if we call initdb, go ahead and initialize the database and then send this text back to the command line, which is initialized database, which we can see right there. Again, I know this is a lot of moving parts inside of here, but once you get this set up as a framework, then you can build multiple applications that are very similar to that going forward. How about you guys online? Are you guys able to follow along thus far?
Yep.
Okay. So now we have our database, and you'll notice that inside of our instance folder, project here, we have this instance folder, and it put the SQLite in there. Now, if we go back up here to our DB, is that the one I'm on? One little piece I wanted to explain there. There we go. So this is what's creating that code to make sure that we created this instance folder and then shove this flaskr.sqlite in there, right? Because notice I never created this instance folder, but we do have it in here. If we look out at our ignore, notice how instance is in our Git Ignore, and therefore that database is not getting sent up to our PyCharm or to our GitHub profile inside of there. So this would be a good spot before we continue any further that we go ahead and commit this code and push it up. So we're going to go to push. Oops, sorry. Commit. And we're going to say set up backend with database. And then we will hit the drop down and hit commit and push. And then push it. I clicked too fast there, but I was going to show you that notice that our instance folder in our database doesn't get submitted up there. So if somebody checks this out, the first thing they have to do is go run this command. So say you wrote this application, right? I pull it down from GitHub. I have to go in and set up this Init Pi to set up my own database so that I'm not pulling all your users and posts and all the test data that you have available. All right, we're going to go over and look at the blueprints and views. When I did this template or this whole setup, it wasn't that bad. Actually, I think this is a good stopping point before we get into setting up the whole view thing, authorizations, and all that kind of code. All right. So see if you can at least get to this part in the tutorial, which is up to blueprints and views. And then from there, we're going to start talking about templates and all the other garbage that we're going to go in. Then we're going to build an entirely separate application for your homework assignment. You guys will extend that, and that'll be your mini project 3. All right. Sounds good. I'll stop the video here.